So we are in Bamidbar, in the wilderness. What a nice metaphor for where we all are right now, huh?
Did
Right.
they pick that on purpose?
This this liminal time period, this in-betweenness, this sense of being in a place that is not the destination, but very much a journey kind of location. And even like Rabbi Susan mentioned this, for a long time, the Israelites don't know that 40 years is how long they're going to be there.
Of course.
They're just wandering.
Right.
And in retrospect, we can look back and say it was 40 years, but you have to imagine in some ways it felt much longer and much shorter for them in the wilderness without that end date. So I don't know. I was empathizing with their situation this morning.
That's right.
So less sort of in the broadest homiletical terms and more talking about the content of the midbar. Does anyone, I'm getting a little bit of an echo, by the way, so I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone else, and please unmute yourself when you talk, though. I'm just doing that to get rid of the echo, but again, please unmute yourself. We want to hear voices. So does anyone want to give an overview of whether this week's Parsha Bamidbar or the whole of the book of Bamidbar? By the way, the Bamidbar literally means in the wilderness, but it's also the name in Hebrew of this entire book, which now in English is known as the Book of Numbers. So anyone want to go for a summary of either of those, the book or the Parsha?
Where does the Parsha begin today?
1-1.
Oh, 1-1. We're just starting.
Makes it easy.
It easy. Okay.
Rabbi Daniel, I just thought it was kind of ironic how they're counting and breaking up all the families into the tribes and counting everybody.
The other thing that is time. Oh, sorry.
Hold on.
Paul, are you still talking?
Oh, go ahead.
You got to be louder. I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. I was just saying how it was ironic how we're counting today all the families into the tribes, and I'm looking at the counting of the different countries of all the coronavirus people that are sick or have died, and it's just continually counts and counts.
Yeah.
Contact tracing.
Yeah.
I was going to say another thing that is timely. Oh, I'm sorry. Another thing that is timely about the counting, it's Memorial Day.
Oh.
And they're counting young people who could fight.
Wow.
So it's a very timely chapter as well.
Yeah. I think another way in which counting is important is that we're doing the national census at this time. Plus, the Missouri powers that be would like to only count for the purpose of distribution of representatives the voting age people instead of everyone.
I never heard of it. What is that? Can you elucidate?
Though I have to wonder if our country wouldn't be better if Missouri had fewer representation. I don't know.
And Texas and
I can think of a whole series of states. In fact, a confederation of states, one might say. So does anyone want to give us a summary of the Book of Numbers? Anyone want to try for that?
Not me.
Yeah, Ron, please.
Not for the whole book, but it starts out with the counting that we're talking about, all the different tribes. And what struck me is how many people there were. There must have been 500,000 people.
So yeah, we're going to talk about the exact number in just a minute, actually. That's where I was going to go. Let me give an overview of the entire book quickly then. Numbers to me is in some ways most similar to the book of Genesis. Just in the sense that it and this is totally like, I may be wrong if you go through and you count each of the whatever's on its own, but just in terms of a feel, Numbers has more stories that sort of exist in their own little pericope of a short story than, for instance, what stands out to me, at least, about Exodus or Leviticus. I mean, what always stands out to me about Exodus, for instance, is I'm always, year after year after year, again surprised that at least half of the book of Exodus is full of priestly content, right? Like, we get the great drama of Exodus, but in some ways the great drama of Exodus is done in, I don't remember how many chapters, 12 chapters, 15 chapters, whatever it is. And almost the rest of the book of Exodus is filled with priestly concerns: how to build the tabernacle, how many in the tabernacle, what's it made of, let's give a description of how we should make it. Now let's give the exact same description, but use verbs that describe it as how we are making it, right? Like, over and over and over again, we get that. And I'm always surprised by that in Exodus. Leviticus, it doesn't surprise us that it's filled with like sacrifice stuff and priestly stuff, because Leviticus, right, literally, in fact, the name of it, Leviticus, is the guide for the priests. But when you get into the book of Numbers, we get all sorts of short stories. We get the story of Korah. We get the story of Aaron's two sons who offer the alien fire, and whatever happens to them and they die. We get the story of Pinchas, the zealot, who kills someone for engaging in interfaith relationship, right? Like, we have all of these short stories, some of them wonderful, some of them awful, that show up in the book of Numbers. We get my daughter Noah is named after the book of Numbers. The daughter, ironically, right, like the some of the great examples of feminism in the Torah, they themselves are often known as the daughters of Zelophehad, right? They don't even get remembered as their own name. They're instead named after their father in even how we remember them all too often. But Noah is one of them, and we give my Noah her name from that. So we have all of these short stories that show up in this book, in Bamidbar, in Numbers, which is why I compare it to the book of Genesis. Okay, thoughts on that for a second? Anyone have a reaction or response? That makes sense? Everyone's muted now, but I see the, yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you have something to say too.
Okay. Question, do you think that the death of the sons of Aaron for bad fire was punishment for Aaron for bringing about the golden calf? Is there any logic in that?
So you certainly end up seeing the golden calf be attributed to lots and lots of later things that go wrong. I would suggest that the golden calf in some ways is as close as we get to a Christian notion of a fall from grace. It's kind of ironic, right? Of course, that the Christian notion of a fall comes actually from our stories, right? But that's not how we read the story of the leaving from the Garden of Eden. That's not a classically Jewish read, that it's a fall from grace or into sin or whatever, right? A classical Christian read. But the closest we get to theologies like that is Exodus 32, the golden calf, which again and again comes up as being sort of the explanation for things like that. So John, I don't know if that is given, but I would be surprised if there's not a commentary somewhere that doesn't make that connection. Other thoughts here?
No, just a quick, John, is that like wallpaper behind you? Is that your screenshot?
Oh, no, that is because I actually have Zoom on my computer, and this is what Zoom does. It'll give you a fake background, but I didn't really plan this, believe me. It's the Golden Gate Bridge. It's
very lovely.
You should say you planned it because it looks great.
Yeah. Yeah, you should have said, no, that's where you're sitting.
Yeah, that's where I cannot tell a lie.
Yeah.
Try.
It's Shabbos.
Okay, so Did that make sense as sort of a general overview
Yes.
of Book of Numbers? Okay. I want to go into a little more overview of where the literature in the Book of Numbers came from. And
You're on?
I'm hearing someone in the background.
Yeah.
Just a little overview of where the Book of Numbers came from, because we have this moment in this week's Parsha where it does, let me see if I've gotten it on one of our commentaries that I pulled, where we go through and we actually get a list of the numbers of people that are there. I'm trying to see, I don't think I actually pulled anything that has the full number. Does anyone remember the number that's given in the Torah this week? Or the closest we get?
605,300
Yeah.
some odd people.
Yeah, I remember 600,000.
And I was losing the end of that sentence. So I heard about 600,000, and what was the end?
No, he said 605,000.
And it's not, just to be clear, we're not talking about the total number of people, right? Who does that describe? Who falls into that category?
It's the ones that are 20 years old and older, but it also doesn't include the Levites in this, or the Kohanim.
Okay, so yeah, there's some pretty big categories that this doesn't include.
And it's only males, it says.
There you go, right? That's probably the biggest category that it doesn't include. Renee?
I think that mostly it's counting these people who have potential for defense or the military, adventures. In other words, the men they can count on to defend or engage in military encounters. That's the best I can do it.
And that is, of course, at least the explanation for why there is a census happening, or one of the explanations, which is that we know that we're about to go into the land of Israel. We're nearing the end of this journey, and it's immediately going to be a war. And so we need to have our military in tip-top shape. It's interesting that we kind of often forget that piece, and I think we forget it because we don't read the stories of the battles, right? Like, if we were reading this narrative the way that the narrative wants to be told, we would go straight from the book of Deuteronomy into the book of Joshua. But we don't. We start right back over. But Deuteronomy wants to go into Joshua. Deuteronomy wants to continue its story. It doesn't understand itself as an endpoint in that sense. And so we're not used to thinking of it that way. Renee, yeah.
So it occurs to me that there'll be subsequent censuses, as we go through the Tanakh, and particularly in the Book of Kings, where it's really clear that it's for military purposes. So I'm wondering if this isn't a sort of literary foretelling, it's actually sort of not an anachronism looking backward, but forward. In other words, it's there to establish a precedent.
Nice.
For doing it when it's really necessary.
Nice. So, yeah.
I just had this image flash in my head that I don't know how long they've been wandering at this point. I know we're past 40 days or 3 months or whatever it is. That some way, like Moses woke up and said, how many people am I leading? Let's figure out what this crazy band is, and let's start getting this organized. I mean, he's organized a court system, but there's no order to this madness. So he sets out how many people he has that are of counting age by their way of doing it, and then he sets them up in districts or little communities, around it. But it was time to get order into this chaos.
Nice. So we have 600,000 or so men between the ages of 20 and 80 who are counted here. So anyone want to try to figure out sort of a back of the envelope math of how many people we're talking about? I said 20 and 80, 20 and 60, excuse me.
It's probably between 1 and 2 million if you add women and children.
Yeah, right. You got to figure that there's probably the equivalent number of women. So now we're at 1.2 million or so. And then all of the people under 20, and you got to think in a society like this, actually your average age is probably close to that. And then you're talking about whatever section of the population is over 60.
Which is probably not that much in those days.
Probably not that much, but still larger than you'd imagine. One of the things we see from the archaeological record is that while lifespans were shorter, if you make it to 40 or 50, your odds are pretty good that you're going to make it to 60 or 70. That's one of the things that we see in the archaeology that sort of comes as a surprise sometimes to us.
Daniel,
Yeah.
weren't there tribes at this time too?
Yeah,
Was that not an organizing force?
right.
And
Nice.
supposedly, other than the Hebrews, left with the Hebrews, right?
Yes.
Are they
So
part of the
let's-
count? Or is that where you have to figure out another 100,000 or something?
Nice. Great comments. Let's take all of this together. And we haven't even jumped into any text yet, but that's okay. We've got some text waiting for us here. So
Can I just go on what Larry was saying?
Yeah.
Because we talked about the Yetzer Hara, did they get allotted to the different tribes?
Who is the they?
We're told Randy loves talking about all the non-Jewish people who came out with us.
Erev Rav.
So did they get allotted to the different tribes? I always wondered about that.
Okay, let's take all of this. I think there's some big questions that are emerging from this, and I want to try addressing it in two different ways. I want to address it in a what we know historically, and then I want to address it in terms of what contemporary Jewish tradition answers. Does that make sense as two different approaches? So if we're talking about 2 million people or so, 2 million people who entered into the land of Israel, and we know the dates are roughly going to be, 3,200 years ago, 3,500 years ago, something like that, right? That number of people entering into an area as small as the land of Israel are going to show up, right? We're going to see them today. We're going to see them today in the records of destructions, right? You can see the layers, literally the word is the tells, right? Like Tel Aviv, the layers of archaeology. You can see the burn layers for when destructions happen, and right, look in the book of Joshua and Judges and so on and so forth. You can see all the destructions that are described. We're also going to see all sorts of other changes. We're going to see oil lamps that are made differently because people came from a different region, and we're going to see that change in the archaeology. We're going to see pottery designs differently. We're going to see plates. We're going to see the way that homes are built differently. The look of the idols within the homes are going to be different, right? All of these things are going to change if you've got 2 million people coming in to a region.
So do we see those changes?
None of them. None. There is a total and complete lack of any archaeological evidence for something that looks like Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, which is particularly startling because some of the descriptions are quite geographical, right? Like, we know where the city of Jericho is. The destruction in the Battle of Jericho is very well described, right? Like, they even tell us how many times they go around the outside before the walls come a-tumbling down, as the song says, right? In fact, the whole idea in a wedding where the couple circles 7 times, right, before they go into the chuppah, comes from Jericho, that there should be no walls between them. 7 times the walls come down. But it doesn't exist. There's no destruction layer that we find, and we find all sorts of other destruction layers. We find the Babylonian destructions, the Assyrians, we can see lots of archaeology. We don't find the changes in consumer culture that we would expect, the way the lights are made and things like this. And so we are left with this issue of like, how do we explain this? Okay, did that make sense? Any thoughts on that? And I'll jump into how we explain it a little bit as we go.
So do we have any evidence at all that the Exodus actually occurred?
None. In fact, I would say it's the opposite of that. There is a stunning lack of evidence in the places that we would expect there to be evidence. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So let's take the next step then. Let's look at this extra biblically for a moment. We would expect that anything like an exodus from Egypt, a slave rebellion, of course, it's going to be documented in our stories, but we would also expect it to be documented in Egyptian sources. So it turns out if you go to Egyptian sources, there is a reference to a slave rebellion, which in the broadest of senses lines up with the time period that we would expect this to have occurred in. And there's a reference in Egyptian sources to a slave rebellions amongst the Ivri. And anyone who knows that word, I've seen it spelled in English. Obviously, I don't read ancient Egyptian. Is Ivri. Hey, sweetie, that's probably good that no worms came out of your strawberry. That was my Noah, and I'm going to reclose this door over here. Yeah. So this word shows up in Egyptian sources, and it's so close to the word that we use for ourselves, Hebrews, right? Which might be related even to the word to cross over, like the people who moved from that place to this other place, right? So hold on, I need to tell my children to be quiet. Sorry.
Danny, don't worry that much. All during last night's service, Harry and George were discussing things in the background, and Susan didn't even shush them.
I know. Well, first of all, that's the difference between a grandparent and a parent right there. I know. I see it, and I'm so jealous. My parents are totally quarantined, and so we are totally on our own. I like just want to pass my children over there sometimes. Okay. So we have this word, Ivri, these people who crossed over, and we hear in this Egyptian source about a slave rebellion amongst them. But what's interesting about this is that the word in Egyptian is much closer to the concept that we get with Arab.
You just froze, Danny.
We were getting to the
Danny will figure it out. He's the expert. He'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Hello, Danny. You froze.
We're here.
So
It's
while
like
we're waiting,
Ufro Salenu. Hey, Suzanne, is Paul with you? Suzanne, unmute. There he is. Hey, Paul.
Shabbat shalom, kulam.
So Paul, continue with the history lesson about the.
First of all, the Egyptian word translates people without laws.
Okay. Go on.
But the use is several hundred years distant from any possible Exodus. I cannot. You have to understand 2 million people, 2 million humans, even for a short period of time, raise one hell of a lot of crap. there's all kinds of waste, and they just leave it. And it isn't there. It never occurred that there can't be that many people moving.
You know, I just finished reading this brand new biography of David Ben-Gurion, and he liked to think of himself as a scholar in certain ways. And late in life, he came to the conclusion that the 600,000 was actually 600.
Sounds good. I suspect that there were only members of the Judaic tribes too. That there were other tribes, Manasseh, in the
Does any of us live there?
north of Kinneret, and who spoke a Hebrew language, who made baths and had a technology of water movement, who made plates, who had ceramics, and the southern tribes never did.
So Paul, this is your area of expertise. So
everyone, sorry about that.
Danny's back. Okay.
Our internet totally.
Paul was regaling us because this is his area of expertise.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
There just could not have been as many people as are described. And also, there were, I only see the southern tribes there. And I'll go along with Ben-Gurion. 600 is much better than 6,000. 6 million. 6 million.
Yeah. Danny, when you were away, I was just saying that's what he alluded to, 600. I just finished a biography of David Ben-Gurion, a brand new one, and he considered himself like a scholar, a dilettante in lots of things. And late in life, when he wasn't prime minister anymore, he was doing a lot of research, and he came up that the 600,000 was really 600.
So right, like, there have been lots of theories attempting to get at this. I'm not sure exactly where I cut out. Did you hear me talking about the Ivri, the Egyptians?
Yeah. You cut out with Ivri, and then you started talking about Egyptian.
Okay, so the concept of Ivri, interestingly, in Egyptian, is much closer to Rabbi Randy's concept of Erev Rav, mixed multitude, which is that in Egyptian, Ivri does not refer to an ethnic or tribal group. It's much closer to a concept like the subcontinental idea of untouchables or fringy folk or others in the big sense of that. It's people who are not us, but are them. And it includes a servitude class kind of element to it as well, and an undesirable quality as well, if that makes sense. So what we get is this Egyptian reference to this Ivri slave rebellion. So the last thing to add here is that we know from all sorts of different sources, contemporaneous sources during this time period, that to be descended from slaves is almost always considered a shameful thing. And so it's not something that you would want to be well known, and it's not something you would take pride in. And so because of that, there is this general idea, and you should treat this with many, many grains of salt because you can see how fallible it can be. But there's this general idea that stories that make you look bad probably have more historical reality to them than stories that make you look good. Just like in the broadest of senses. Does that make sense as a concept?
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Hey, Danny?
Yeah.
Sometimes Haaretz has articles concerning this around Passover.
Yeah.
in one of the articles, unfortunately, I didn't keep them, and I don't remember all of them, but one was that Egypt controlled a lot of land up towards what is now Israel or Canaan or whatever. And so maybe departing as slaves or whatever was really, as you said, a rebellion or a separation from part of the population that was in that area anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Which is to say that probably what we're talking about is something that looks something like this, that there is a slave rebellion of an Erev Rav, in the Rabbi Randy sense of this, like a mixed multitude of fringy slave folk in Egypt, right? This is not one specific ethnicity, though it's totally within the realm of the likely that there was one ethnicity that makes up the bulk of it, right? Like that would make sense in a slave rebellion and in a slave population. But we're dealing with a mixed multitude that escapes from Egypt. Again, there's lots of question marks historically on everything I'm saying right now, but this is the closest to a probably that we have. In that slave rebellion of a much smaller size than 2 million people traveling through the wilderness, right? Like 2 million people, that's 2/3 of the St. Louis metro area traveling together for 40 years.
It's almost the size of Brooklyn.
Right? Like it's twice Memphis is how I keep thinking of it. So we're probably talking a much smaller group that makes their way into the north of Israel. And in the north of Israel, they settle into some of the mountains that we now consider, ironically, the West Bank, where the Palestinian population lives. And there they, in many ways, settle, and it's probably not much of a military victory or a conquest or a battle. It's probably mostly a settlement. And they settle in, they begin to look like their neighbors and talk like their neighbors and act like their neighbors and sacrifice animals like their neighbors and do everything else like their neighbors, but they share a different story about who they are and where they came from. And what happens is, over however many generations, you know, let's say that there are 3,000 men instead of 600,000, just making up a number. 4 generations later, after they've settled in this region, you could imagine that a significant number of human beings are alive who share the story that they are descendants of this slave rebellion, even if technically only one of their 16 great-great-great-grandparents came from there. Okay, that's the closest we get to a version of this story that sort of history has. Thoughts on this, questions on this, comments on this?
I love being thought of as a fringy people.
Bobby, I've long thought of you as being fringy folk, so you know.
I'm happy.
For me, the question then becomes, why do you create this kind of myth as to be one of the foundational or principal myths of our people?
Well, that's
Maybe it's not that much of a myth. That's what he's saying.
well.
No,
Maybe
the myth has, you may have that much.
I mean, if you're a slave,
yeah, but
you know.
why create a myth of that proportion and of that origin to define?
because everybody else did.
Yeah, everyone has an origin story.
I
agree.
To provide,
Why to
I mean, and especially like I love comic books.
Danny
Everybody has
Wise.
an origin story.
it's
Hold on,
to
Patty, go
provide,
ahead. Sorry. Hold on.
I was
we're
wondering
hearing-
too.
Patty,
I was
go ahead.
wondering, I agree. I was wondering why I mean, that myth is huge that there's so many people, the Exodus. So I was wondering how come it was such a massive, because that a bunch of people has a huge impact more than just settling and, you know what I mean? So I didn't understand how come it would come like that.
the myth is to provide unity.
That's right. In all
They are all children of the 12 sons.
Mhm.
And they're therefore united and brothers.
Leon wanted to speak.
Yeah, well, the fact is, there's an awful lot of myths. Look at the Roman and Greek myths about where you come from. You always have to conquer somebody to have the land. And this is another one of conquering people, so they own the land. That's all the ancient myths, or not all of them, but all of them that I know are that way. Period.
Renee?
So it's been my observation, over a lifetime of studying history, that what you often find from it is not what happened, but what was going on at the time that the historian was writing about it. In other words, and at the beginning of this Torah study session, you started to, you tantalized us with this, let's consider when this book might have been written. And so I'm going to kind of toss that back to you, because it occurs to me that this inflation of numbers might have a lot to do with that.
Nice. So sort of responding to lots of voices here. Everyone understands what I mean when I say a game of telephone. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right? Like I whisper one secret to, I'm just looking in the squares that I've got on here, to Mike, and Mike will whisper it to Larry, and Larry will whisper it to Bob, right? Like, and so on, it keeps going. And by the end, what's funny is, Patty is going to read the thing at the end. She's in my bottom corner, and then we're all going to laugh at how different it is than what we began with, right?
Right.
I want us to totally and completely throw out the image of telephone when we think about these stories. It tends to be how we think about them, where we focus on this idea that there was an original version of this story, and that is what we're trying to get back to, is what the original real version is, right? I want us to totally and completely throw that out, because I don't think it fits in with how we should understand this. I want to take apart that word myth, and some of you have heard me do this before, because I think it's really central, that we tend to use the word myth to mean a story that's not historically true. But in a much more technical sense, a myth is a story that tells us who we are, where we came from, and how we are supposed to live in this world.
Oh.
Right? So the irony of this, of course, is that the ancient Greek myths, the things that we think of as being like the most paradigmatically myths, were myths to the ancient Greeks, but are myths to no one today. No one reads those as a way of understanding who they are or where they came from. Maybe contemporary Greeks do, right, at some level, but in a very different kind of way, right? That's their sacred ancient literature, but not like divine literature, right? And so we all are filled with myths. Every story we tell that explains who we are is myth, from like the way that I talk about my great-grandparents coming to America, and the Golden Medina, and the business my grandpa built, to the to the American story, to the Jew. It really doesn't matter. Whenever we tell these stories, whether we're talking about our own family history, or we're talking about our tribal history, our Jewish history, our American history, or whatever, we are speaking in the realm of myth, because we are telling stories that tell us who we are, where we came from, and stories that explain how we're supposed to live in the world. Does that make sense as just a baseline understanding of that concept?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think there's humans have a strong desire to identify themselves and know who they are and how they fit into the rest of the world. And I think that's what drives that.
Totally. So what I want to suggest is that Marion.
Wherever it started, when I teach this, I think the myth is crucial to who we are. Because at the bottom line, it's a story of a group of people who leave something, stick together, and then recreate something new. And that is the touchstone for how Jews have survived through everything they have survived. So however it starts, that story is absolutely crucial to the fact that we haven't disappeared. If your origin story ties you to a geographical place or a time, and that geographical place disappears, you're out of luck. The very basis of our story is you leave and you become something new. And I think that's just absolutely crucial and why it's become a bigger and bigger and bigger thing. Nice. And you see it in the next year in Jerusalem, which in all our Haggadahs, or in, the whole idea of personalizing the story and living it. I'm done.
So jumping off of what Marianne said, and then I'll go to you in a second, Patty. Has anyone ever been to a Passover Seder that didn't in some way have a contemporary political bend to it? Because I never have. I
grew up with those Seders.
Yeah, I grew up with those Seders.
With no politics, there was no way.
Oh, no.
No. There was just family politics.
I was at my grandparents' house. My grandfather was a shochet, and grandmother and grandfather were very, very observant, even though we were part of B'nai Amunah, which was supposed to be not Orthodox. And it was just the full Haggadah from beginning to end, and you went through that story. There was no politics. There was no further discussion.
So there was no, even in that generation, for instance, discussion of the Holocaust. Is that what you're saying?
Nothing.
Oh, no.
I recall.
No.
I mean, I was young. I'm pretty old now, but
So
you're not ancient, Larry. You're not ancient.
Yeah, pretty.
So
old.
I came to it a little later, though, and the Seders that I first became involved in revolved a lot around. At the time, we were trying to get Jews out of Russia.
That's what I was going to say. Soviet Seders, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That was older already. That was older. But I'm like Larry. When I was growing up, my grandpa was the Gabi of an Orthodox synagogue. They kept the Glatt kosher home. We just did the Haggadah, and that was primarily it. The meal was the most important thing. And I don't ever remember politics being discussed at the Seder table.
So part of this might be, I want to expand what I mean by politics too. And I'm sure that there are also specific examples that aren't this. But I guess my broader point here is that in almost every telling of Passover that's probably ever happened, when it's told around the Seder table, I'm talking the last 2,000 years. When it's told around the Seder table, it is told in light of the current events that are happening in that family and that political reality, whether it is Soviet Jewry, whether it is post-Holocaust, whether it is pogroms, whether it is the Inquisition, whether it is that in almost every telling that's ever happened of that, in some ways, the way that we tell the story is a reflection of our current reality as much as the original text. And what I want to suggest with that is that has always been true, that the people who were literally slaves in Egypt and fleeing also had stories about an ancient past where people were slaves and became free. And they were telling those stories as a way to inspire themselves for the future. And that has always been the case. Or to say it all differently, when we've asked these questions of how did it get to be 600,000? I want to totally reject the notion that there was a human being, an individual human being that sat down and wrote out that number like they were writing out a story. Instead, every generation is retelling the story, and every teller of the story is retelling it as they understand it for their moment. And people don't even get that they're doing this necessarily, but it's only later on, right? Once we write it down and have an official version, that in some ways the story becomes much more stuck. But even then, it's not totally stuck, right? Like Dr. King revolutionized the Moses story, right? Can we think of going to a mountaintop without thinking of Dr. King? I'm not sure. I can't. Okay, there are lots of hands. Renee, then John.
Okay, well, actually, my first thought is, the first Seders that I remember always told in the context of the civil rights movement. Because I was a kid in the, early and mid 60s, and always that in the background. Always.
So you're a youngster.
Yeah, I would also suggest that in its own moment and in its own way, doing just the Maxwell House Haggadah is also a political statement. It's a different kind of politics, a different reflection of its reality, but it certainly speaks to like the politics of assimilation and and again, in politics, I don't mean what shows up in the New York Times. I mean reflections of our current reality. Yeah, Leon.
Yeah, the fact is that anybody who uses the basic Haggadah has a prayer for his own his own country, which is definitely political. There's just no question about it, that being political.
We didn't think of it.
Leon was going to say something. Yeah.
Think of it.
Or sorry, not Leon. John, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say that when I was going to Seder's in 1948, which was, or 48 and 50, which was, 5 years after the Holocaust wasn't mentioned. And there are a lot of things that are so horrible, like, say family incest, family problems, murder in the family, horrible things. They're not mentioned. And so I asked my mother, in about 1955 or 60, I says, how come nobody did anything? And she says, we didn't know. But they basically suppressed all this stuff and you couldn't talk about it. It's only now in the present time when we talk about problems more freely. But in the 50s, it was suppressed.
So,
my family.
So just a quick sociology that might help there. Right, in the 1950s in the United States, Holocaust knowledge, Holocaust education, and Holocaust theology had not fully entered in. You don't find that until the mid to late 60s.
Right. They didn't know, but whatever.
So, but the other thing to understand for the 1950s, which helps explain some of the politics of that, or the late 40s, is that this is the moment when Ashkenazi Jews are becoming a religious group rather than an ethnic group. And it's also at the moment when religion has become the way for Ashkenazi Jews to be white. And so presenting a Judaism that is fundamentally a religious rather than an ethnic tradition is also, right? Like that's part of the politics of the moment, even if we don't understand it as politics, and even if they didn't understand it as politics or even see it. There was another hand I saw somewhere. Marion.
It's me. It's Marion. I was just going to say, even if the leader did not make it explicit, for those of you who had that Orthodox Passover, it doesn't mean that everybody around the table isn't having their own thoughts. I mean, one of the basic things you have to learn when you're teaching is that what you say and where you lead is nowhere close to where everybody is hearing and going. And so the very fact that the story has that structure, you just can't deny it. Even if you're a little kid sitting there wandering off on your own thinking, it just inspires that whole question of moving and changing, I think, even if the leader did not make it space for it to be explicit.
Patty?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as a therapist, you try to challenge people's stories they tell themselves, to reframe it. So like, let's say someone has this horrid story of their family of origin. I try to, that's a skill, I think, and a tool you try to use is, why don't you reframe that in a different story you tell yourself? Because it evokes so much a different
how you tell it,
emotion and mentality, and just drive forward to live your life. I mean, if you change the story in your head, it's going to change so many factors of your life. So I just find that interesting that even as you speak, and teach, people have this own, like Miriam was saying, a different interpretation. So
how do you tell it?
Friends, I have to go. I'm sorry. I'm doing family services and regular services today.
Oh my God.
I'm particularly impressed with us though, because normally I make a text sheet and I always think I didn't put enough on there. We're going to get halfway through. We're going to have no more content. and it's always the opposite. And today we never even made it to the text sheet. You can see I made all these pretty graphics too. Are these popping up for you? You see these?
Yes, very nice.
Right?
You can save them for next year.
Exactly. But Midbar's waiting for us. I have to go, and we're actually
quick question for you, Ganny. Are they purposely doing that? Because last week Randy did all 3 in a row.
It just has happened this way.
That's crazy. There's 5 of you. Come on, mix it up.
Yeah, we mean to. Yeah, I don't know. Good to see everyone. Take care.
With Randy, he can learn.
Shabbat shalom.
I'll see.
I'm going to leave this open for a minute if anyone wants to hang out.
Okay.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you,
very
Jerry.
much. Thank you very much for another wonderful session. Hello, Leon. You got a joke?
I have several of them, but the class is always the biggest joke.
Helene, you're muted.
Come on, Leon. Make me laugh.
Bobby,
Yes.
do you have the little dots that say more on your thing where the chat comes in? If you go to that spot, there's a thing that says virtual background, and you can pick something so I don't have to look at your stove anymore.
I tried. I couldn't.
Not all computers have.
I have an
software.
iPad, but I have the option in my Zoom thing where you can
Well, the
just
iPad is, that's different. This is I got a Chromebook, it's pretty basic.
All right. Well, look around in where the chat and stuff is and see if you can pick up.
I'm in chat right now, and
Bye, everybody.
nothing.
There.
Bye, Renee.
Bye, Renee.
Bye.
Okay.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay, because my thing isn't coming up green.
Okay, there you are.
Now it is. Shabbat shalom, everyone. I'm going to go. Okay.
Hi,
Bye-bye.
Dolores.
Bye. See you next week.
Bye. Shabbat shalom.
Okay, bye-bye.
I'm shocked that no one has said anything about Trump's removal of the.
We don't talk about him.
I
Just
know
yet.
that.
I wait to Passover to talk about him.
Yeah.
I was hoping you'd be poor.
Paul, you're good with technology. This is what I got. It has getting started, audio,
I am
video,
not good.
hearing.
Bobby, I am not good at technology. I'm sorry.
Oh, I thought you were.
No, I only sell it. I don't know it.
That was a good one. Thanks for the laugh. I'm going to see maybe Zoom rooms I could do. I'm trying to figure out how to change the background.
I like that background. It's you.
I know. But I just want to see.
It's him.
Set up.
Especially
Okay,
when you get
recommended
up and you get
settings.
something to eat or drink, and I'm like, well, I don't have anything to eat or drink. When are you going to deliver? I mean, come on.
Okay.
But I have
Recommended settings. Hey, Helene, I got something that says recommended settings for home office Zoom rooms. Is that it?
Well, mine's an iPad, so click on it and see what happens.
Okay.
It ended up as a blade of grass the time I did it. It was pretty cool, actually.
I really liked John's, the Golden Gate Bridge.
And Karen Plotty has a way that she put up a picture of being in the mitzvah garden.
Oh, I know. That's great. That's great. I tried. I can't find it. Yeah.
Well, just keep looking around. And there's a way that you can put up a photo out of your own photo collection.
I would do that, but I don't know how.
Well,
Bye, everybody.
I have
tomorrow, one of a youngster's coming over. They'll figure it out.
Okay.
I have a picture of SpongeBob's house.
That'll be so good, Leon, to get you out of the closet finally. I'm tired of looking at
I am. It's symbolic, isn't it?
Leon, why don't you use it?
What? SpongeBob?
SpongeBob's house.
Sure. It's under the sea.
Okay, people, I'm going. I'm going to try to catch Danny's kids. I love watching them. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. I'm going to the great cathedral downtown because the president told me to. So that's where I'm going.
Still on this? I'm still
you-
hearing everyone.
Well, I figure the best thing if everybody goes to church is that all those right-wing evangelicals will get COVID and will get rid of that part of his base.
The only church I go to is my parish church, the college church. I don't think it's open. St. Xavier's at SLU. That's my church. It's the only one I have. That's my church. My school fees paid for it, so I have a vested interest in that place.
Yeah.
I have my own pew even.
Yeah, I can smell it from here.
Okay. Adios.
Bye-bye.
I'd get off if I knew how.
Don't you have a little button, Leon, that says leave?
I got all these buttons from one, two,
three. Out.
One of them
here somewhere.
Mine is a red little thing at the top.
Mine usually is, but I seem not to have that. Here, I'll find it.
But Leon, I got a question for you because I didn't get to ask this because Bobby does all the talking.
Yes,
I don't remember, my Seders were all real traditional. And I remember when the Leonard Baskin Haggadah came out from the Reformed Jews, it was the first thing that seemed relevant and modern. But I think everybody knew that our ancestors, my grandfather had come over here. So we had our own Exodus story that was just inherent in it, but it wasn't discussed. And since all the leaders of that generation were pretty well schooled in their Judaism, we led a traditional Seder.
Mm-hmm.
Kids were all running around, but there was no need to make it relevant to today.
Right.
Well,
that's excellent, Helene.
We
Excellent.
had the coffee Seder, and at the
You mean the Maxwell House?
The Maxwell House, correct.
Right, us too.
And at the very end, there was all kinds of prayers for the United States.
Right. But
You don't consider that political?
We didn't do those.
Oh,
Yeah.
We did them.
We sang the songs and that was it. By the way, that Maxwell House Seder, remember, you might not remember, but there's a picture of a Seder plate at the beginning. It's very pretty. Well, I took care of this lady, and what was her last name? It was her brother's family's Seder plate because he was the chief rabbi of Philadelphia, and he put together that Haggadah and did the translations. And
that's great.
Oh,
They belong to B'nai Emunah now. And her grandson-in-law was the assistant rabbi there for about